On the afternoon of June 17, 1775, General John Bergen stood on the heights of Copp's Hill in Boston and watched the finest soldiers in the world walk into a massacre. Down below, across the Charles River, a column of red-coated British regulars was climbing Breed's Hill in parade formation, perfectly dressed lines, polished boots, muskets at the shoulder, bayonets catching the late afternoon sun. They were the product of decades of European military doctrine, the most disciplined infantry force on earth, moving uphill through tall grass and broken ground toward a dirt fort thrown up overnight by farmers. Bergen watched, a man who had seen real war, who understood what those numbers meant, who had the professional soldier's instinct for reading the geometry of a killing field. He saw the field ahead of his men, the unmown hay that hid rocks and fence posts, the stone walls running at angles across the slope, the grass-stuffed rail fence along the mystic river beach. He saw the men inside the redoubt, barely visible, unnervingly still. He wrote about it later, and now ensued, he recorded, one of the greatest scenes of war that can be conceived. He was not wrong. What came next was 2 hours that shook an empire, buried 226 British soldiers in foreign ground, sent another 828 to the surgeons, and forced London to confront the thing it had spent 2 years refusing to believe. These people would actually fight. The British won the hill. They paid for it so dearly that their commanding general, after surveying the wreckage of his assault force, called it, in a dispatch he never intended to become famous, a dear-bought victory. He was right about that too. Another victory like it, as one British officer remarked, would have ruined them entirely. To understand how Bunker Hill happened, you need to understand what the British government believed about the American colonies in the spring of 1775. They believed the rebellion was a tantrum, a loud, irritating tantrum thrown by a minority of rabble-rousers, radical lawyers, reckless merchants, hot-headed pamphleteers, who had whipped up a population of otherwise loyal subjects into temporary hysteria. The vast majority of colonists, London assumed, were sensible people who wanted trade, not war. The Sons of Liberty and their kind were troublemakers. Give them a sharp, decisive military demonstration of British power, and they would back down. They always did. This assumption had a long pedigree. It had been confirmed, in the minds of men like King George III and his ministers, by the relative tameness of colonial resistance in previous years. The Stamp Act protests, Parliament had repealed the Stamp Act. The Boston Massacre, only 5 colonists killed, hardly a massacre by any military standard. The Boston Tea Party, theatrical, yes, criminal, absolutely, but manageable. The answer was the coercive acts. Close the port, strip Massachusetts of self-governance, make the colony feel the financial and political consequences of disobedience. The rest of the colonies would learn the lesson vicariously. What London did not adequately account for was that the rest of the colonies watched the punishment of Massachusetts and concluded, with growing unanimity, that they were next. The coercive acts were supposed to isolate Massachusetts. They united it with every other colony instead. By early 1775, General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief in North America and military governor of Massachusetts, was sending increasingly desperate dispatches to London. He was a realistic man. He had spent years in America. He knew the countryside, knew the people, knew the militia tradition that ran through every New England town like a current under still water. He wrote to his superiors that if force was to be used, it needed to be overwhelming, 20,000 men or more, or the resistance would simply harden. He warned that beginning with small numbers would encourage rather than terrify. London sent him 2,500 reinforcements and 3 new generals. His own officers called him the Old Woman. Parliament called him indecisive. One of his officers, Lord Percy, remarked with aristocratic disdain that the general's leniency only made the colonists more daring and insolent. Gage himself, in a moment of unguarded exhaustion, is said to have called Boston this cursed place. He was not wrong about that either. On June 12, 1775, General Gage and his newly arrived subordinates, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Bergen, finalized a plan to break the siege. They would use the Royal Navy to land troops on Dorchester Heights, south of Boston, and on the Charlestown Peninsula to the north, seizing the high ground that dominated the harbor and giving them the platform to push the colonial forces west away from the city. It was a reasonable plan. It was also a secret for approximately one day. By June 13th, an anonymous New Hampshire informant described by the Provincial Congress as a gentleman of undoubted veracity had delivered the British timetable to the American commander, General Artemas Ward. The Colonial Intelligence Network in Boston, fed by sympathizers inside the city, by conversations overheard at taverns and officers' dinner tables, by the loose operational security of a command that had not yet learned to be afraid, was considerably better than the British understood. Ward had 5 days. He called a council. The decision was made: occupy the Charlestown Peninsula before the British could, fortify the heights, and force the issue on American terms rather than British ones. On the night of June 16th, Colonel William Prescott assembled roughly 1,200 men at Cambridge, 3 Massachusetts regiments, and a detachment of Connecticut troops under the future hero Israel Putnam. A minister from Harvard, President Samuel Langdon, led them in prayer. Then they marched in darkness and silence across Charlestown Neck, the narrow strip of land that connected the peninsula to the mainland, and up into the hills above Boston Harbor. Their orders were to fortify Bunker Hill, the highest ground on the peninsula, 110 feet above the water. For reasons that military historians have debated for 250 years and never fully resolved, Prescott led his men to Breed's Hill instead. It was lower, 75 feet, and closer to Boston, sitting almost directly above the harbor where British warships lay at anchor. Some historians argue the position was chosen precisely because its provocative closeness would force a British response. Others think Prescott and Putnam simply made a decision in the dark on unfamiliar ground, and Breed's Hill looked better from where they were standing. Whatever the reason, the choice was made. The men began to dig. They worked in near silence through the warm June night, picks and shovels, no lanterns, whispered orders, building a square earthwork redoubt roughly 130 feet on each side, with walls 6 feet high and a wooden firing platform inside. When the walls were done, they extended a breastwork down the slope toward the harbor. On the far left flank, where the hill slope ran down to the narrow beach along the Mystic River, Colonel John Stark arrived with 2 New Hampshire regiments and began fortifying an existing split-rail fence with additional posts, stones, and hay stuffed between the rails to stop British musket balls. By 4 in the morning, a Royal Navy officer aboard HMS Lively spotted the freshly turned earth on the heights above him and reported it to his captain. On the other side of the harbor, Boston began to wake up to a completely different morning. General Gage and his officers met at 9 in the morning to look at what had appeared overnight on Breed's Hill and decide what to do about it. They had options. General Henry Clinton, the sharpest tactical mind in the room, urged an immediate move: land troops at Charlestown Neck, seal off the peninsula, and let the colonists wither on the vine. Cut off from reinforcement and supply, the men on Breed's Hill would either surrender or be picked off at leisure. The move was bold, and it was right. It would have ended the matter without the frontal assault that was about to unfold. Clinton was outvoted. The other generals believed his plan risked getting the landing force cut off between the colonists on the hills and any militia that might rush down from Cambridge. And beyond the tactical calculation, barely acknowledged, but almost certainly present, was something more visceral: the idea that the finest army in the world needed to be seen smashing this rabble directly, openly, in full view of Boston's population, so that no one on either side of the Atlantic could mistake what British regulars were capable of. Howe, as senior officer present, had the decisive voice. He chose the frontal assault. He was confident the colonists would not stand, that the sight of disciplined British troops advancing in formation would break their nerve before they got within musket range. He had reason for this confidence. At every previous confrontation, colonial forces had given way. At Lexington, the militia had dispersed. At the early actions of the siege, the Americans had avoided pitched battle. There was no good reason to believe that farmers with muskets crouched in a dirt fort would hold their ground against the British Army's best. There was also, to be honest, an element of contempt. These were not soldiers. They were tradesmen, farmers, blacksmiths, and fishermen who had grabbed their own weapons and marched to Boston because someone told them the British were coming. The idea that they would stand and fight 3 disciplined assaults in formation against veterans of the 7 Years' War struck the officers planning the assault as frankly implausible. It took 6 hours to organize the attack. 6 hours during which Prescott's men, inside their dirt walls on the hill above, watched the British move and dug deeper. The artillery bombardment that was supposed to precede the assault and break the colonists' spirit never properly materialized. The field guns had been supplied with the wrong caliber of ammunition, 12-pound shot sent to guns that fired 6-pound rounds, a logistical failure of the kind that happens when an army is not taking its enemy seriously enough to double-check its own supply chain. The naval guns of HMS Somerset fired from the harbor, but shallow water and low tide prevented accurate targeting. Shortly after 3 in the afternoon, 28 barges of British soldiers began crossing the Charles River. The British came in 2 wings. On the right, under Howe's personal command, the light infantry companies advanced along the narrow beach at the base of the peninsula, moving in column along the Mystic River's edge, their assignment to curl around the American left flank, sweep behind the rail fence, and attack the redoubt from the rear. On the left, Brigadier General Robert Pigot's force moved uphill directly toward the redoubt and breastwork on Breed's Hill. Howe had planned to advance behind an artillery barrage from the field pieces. The wrong caliber debacle meant his men advanced into the open ground, largely unsupported. What he saw as his light infantry approached the beach along the Mystic River was that it had not, in fact, been left undefended. John Stark had arrived with his New Hampshire regiments and built a solid stone handrail barrier from the fence line all the way down to the waterline, leaving no gap. The narrow beach, the very avenue Howe had counted on to turn the American flank, had become a choke point, a 100-yard corridor of death with water on one side and the barrier on the other. Stark had measured out 50 yards from the fence with a stake, reputedly driving it into the ground himself, and told his men, "Nothing fires until the British cross that marker." They waited. The light infantry column, dozens of men wide and moving at pace, approached the stake. When Stark's men opened fire, the effect was annihilating. The beach was narrow enough that the column could not spread out. The men behind the fence were firing into a compressed formation from close range. The British front rank collapsed. The men behind stumbled into the dead and wounded. A second volley tore through them. A third. Officers trying to rally the column were shot. The beach became, in the words of one American who saw it afterward, a pen of slaughter. The light infantry broke and fell back. On the hill, Pigot's assault against the redoubt had fared no better. The colonists inside, under strict orders from Prescott, who had been walking the top of the walls earlier in the day to steady his men, fully exposed to naval gunfire, refusing to duck, held their fire as the British lines climbed toward them through the tall, unmown grass. At roughly 50 yards, the redoubt opened up. It seemed, one British officer wrote afterward, a continued sheet of fire for near 30 minutes. The front British line fell in rows. Men who did not fall stopped. The formation behind them pushed forward and met the same fire. Officers fell in numbers so disproportionate that it seemed as though the Americans were specifically targeting them, which, with considerable accuracy, they were, under instruction to pick off officers first and break the chain of command. The assault on the redoubt stalled, crumbled, and broke. The British retreated down the hill. On Copp's Hill, watching through a glass, Burgoyne wrote his dispatch. Howe reformed his lines on the lower ground and sent them up a second time. Some of his surviving officers, looking at what the first assault had produced, suggested breaking off the action and reconsidering. Howe declined, in the moment. The decision looks like stubbornness or pride, the refusal of a general to acknowledge that his plan had failed and his assumptions had been wrong. In fairness to Howe, his options were constrained. To withdraw completely would have been to hand the colonists a victory that would echo across the Atlantic. London would not have accepted it. The occupation of Boston, already precarious, would have become untenable. The second assault went up the hill exactly as the first had. Prescott ordered his men to hold fire again. They held it again. When the redoubt opened up the second time, a British officer later wrote that the fire was so intense it had swept the British ranks like a scythe. The entire front-of-house staff was killed or wounded in those two assaults. Every officer who had been riding or standing near him during the advance had gone down. Howe himself survived, untouched, in a manner that bordered on the inexplicable given the volume of fire sweeping the field around him. He later said the experience of watching his men die, men he knew, men he had commanded for years, marked him in a way that never left him. Historians argue to this day whether Bunker Hill is the reason Howe subsequently showed, throughout the rest of the war, a persistent reluctance to press tactical advantages that could have ended the conflict entirely. That afternoon on Breed's Hill may have broken something in his calculation that his soldiers' lives were worth the objectives he was being asked to take. The second assault broke like the first. The British retreated down the hill a second time. Inside the redoubt, the Americans cheered. They also understood something their commanders understood much more acutely. The powder was almost gone. Prescott had been sending messengers to the rear since early afternoon, requesting ammunition. The support they needed never came, partly because of the confusion behind the lines at Bunker Hill, where reserves and newly arrived militia companies milled in disorder, unwilling to cross the exposed Charlestown Neck under naval fire, partly because of the fragmented command structure that left nobody fully in authority over the reinforcements, partly because of the chaos and fear that is the constant companion of men in their first major battle. A British army, with the worst afternoon in recent memory, was about to charge a dirt fort that had almost nothing left to shoot at them. Before the third assault, Howe made 3 decisions that he should have made before the first. He ordered his men to take off their heavy packs, the 60-pound field kits that had been slowing them through the grass and broken ground. He repositioned his artillery to rake the full length of the American line, and he changed the tactical objective. The third assault would not be another attempt to advance in firing lines through open ground. It would be a bayonet charge directed at the redoubt itself. Cold steel, no stopping to fire, straight at the walls. The men who had been decimated twice were going up a third time, this time without the psychological security blanket of returning fire, directly into the fort that had killed so many of them. General Henry Clinton, who had been watching the battle from Boston, commandeered boats and crossed the river with fresh reinforcements from the 2nd Marine Battalion and the 63rd Regiment. He joined the third assault himself. Among the men still standing in the redoubt as the British formed for the third advance was Dr. Joseph Warren. Warren was 34 years old, a Harvard-educated physician, and arguably the most important political mind the colonial resistance had produced in Boston. He had organized the intelligence network that discovered the British plan for Bunker Hill. He had been present at the first revolutionary assemblies, had written the Suffolk Resolves, the document that set the constitutional framework for resistance to British authority, and had been commissioned only days before the battle as a major general, the highest rank in the colonial force. He arrived at the redoubt as a volunteer and insisted on fighting as a private soldier rather than exercising any command authority. Prescott had tried to give him a position of safety. Warren refused. As the third British assault crossed the last yards of open ground and reached the base of the walls, the colonists fired their last shots. Some men had been reduced to throwing rocks and swinging their empty muskets as clubs. The British came over the walls with bayonets. There were no bayonets on the colonial side. Most militia muskets did not have them. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out inside the redoubt, the kind of combat that no amount of determination can sustain against disciplined infantry with cold steel in a confined space when you have nothing to fight back with. Prescott ordered the retreat. He was one of the last men out, parrying British bayonet thrusts with his ceremonial sword. Joseph Warren was killed in the final moments, a musket ball to the head, at close range, in the chaos of the breach. He died inside the redoubt he had chosen to defend as a volunteer. The British, discovering who he was, did not treat the body gently. He was buried on the field without ceremony. Paul Revere later identified his remains by the false tooth Warren wore, a tooth Revere himself had wired in place, making this one of the earliest known instances of forensic dentistry in American history. The retreat off the peninsula was, remarkably, largely disciplined. John Stark's New Hampshire regiments held the rear, keeping British pursuit at bay and allowing most of the wounded to be carried off. General Clinton urged Howe to press forward immediately toward Cambridge, where the Colonial headquarters sat practically undefended after the battle had drained its garrison. Howe, standing in the wreckage of his assault force, his staff almost entirely dead or wounded, declined. The peninsula was British. The war was not over. When the count was done, the numbers told a story that no British officer wanted to tell London. British killed or wounded, 1,054 men out of approximately 2,400 engaged. That is 44% casualties in a single afternoon. Among the dead were 226 soldiers and 92 officers in 2 hours of combat. Of all the British officers killed in the entire Revolutionary War across 8 years of fighting, 1 in every 8 died at what history insists on calling the Battle of Bunker Hill. Major John Pitcairn, the officer who had given the order to fire at Lexington 2 months earlier, whose name was already synonymous in colonial circles with British aggression, was mortally wounded climbing the walls of the redoubt in the third assault. He died in his son's arms. American casualties, approximately 450 killed, wounded, or captured, fewer than half the British losses. Gage sent his report to London on June 25th. He called it a dear-bought victory. He repeated what he had been saying for months, that the rebellion was real, that it required real force to suppress, that the army he had was insufficient for the task, that foreign troops would need to be hired. His report arrived in England on July 25th. 3 days later, the order was issued recalling Gage from command. His career was over. He had been the one honest voice in the entire British command structure, the man who had been telling London, consistently and accurately, that the situation was worse than they wanted to believe. He was sacked for having been right about the consequences of the policy he had been ordered to implement. London's response to the battle was a compound of shock, fury, and reorganization that pointedly avoided addressing the central question the battle had raised. Lord North's government doubled down. King George III formally declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion in August 1775. Parliament rejected the Olive Branch Petition, the final attempt by the Continental Congress to negotiate a resolution short of war, in the same month. The hiring of Hessian mercenaries, which Gage had predicted would be necessary, began. The war that London had assumed would take 1 campaign to end was on track to take 8 years. In Boston, the battle had achieved the precise opposite of its intended purpose. Far from breaking the siege, it had cemented it. The British held Charlestown Peninsula, but the peninsula gave them no strategic advantage. They were still trapped in the city, still unable to move overland, still dependent on supply by sea. The colonists still held every approach. All the battle had done was put 1,054 British casualties into the ground and the hospitals, give the colonial side a deeply traumatic but ultimately galvanizing proof of concept, and demonstrate to anyone paying attention that the most professionally trained army on earth could be stopped cold 3 times by farmers behind a dirt wall. The monument on Breed's Hill, the 221-foot granite obelisk that Bostonians see every day, is, technically, a monument to an American defeat. The British took the hill. The colonists lost it. That is the literal truth of June 17, 1775, and it is almost entirely beside the point. What Bunker Hill did was change the psychological architecture of the entire war. Before it, the British assumption of easy suppression was intact, badly dented by Lexington and Concord, but still operative, still capable of sustaining the argument that one sharp, decisive engagement would settle the matter. After it, that assumption was dead. The men who had watched the first and second assaults break and come back down the hill, farmers, tradesmen, men who had never fought in a pitched battle, who had dug their fort with shovels the night before and held it through 2 full assaults without adequate ammunition or bayonets. Those men knew something afterward that they could not have known before. They knew they could do it. George Washington, who had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army just 2 days before the battle, read the casualty reports from Breed's Hill and reportedly said that the liberties of the country were safe, not because the Americans had won, but because men willing to stand their ground under those conditions were people worth commanding. He was right. The Continental Army he was about to build would need that quality above all others. For General Howe, Bunker Hill left a wound that never entirely healed. He spent the rest of the war in command of British forces, winning tactical victories at Long Island and Brandywine that he somehow never converted into the decisive blow that would end the conflict. Historians still argue about whether he was too cautious, too sympathetic, too scarred by the memory of that hillside to press his advantages to the kill. He was relieved of command in 1778, returned to England, and spent the rest of his life defending his conduct to parliamentary committees that wanted someone to blame for losing America. Gage lived until 1787. He never held a field command again. The man who had been, alone among British commanders, honest about what the war would cost was remembered, when he was remembered at all, as the general who lost Boston. Joseph Warren is buried in a cemetery in Boston. He has a statue near the monument, which a Smithsonian writer once called the tribute to the wild man of revolutionary Boston, overlooked, underknown, arguably the most consequential figure the Patriot cause produced before the shooting started, and dead at 34 before the war he helped to ignite had properly begun. The monument itself was funded partly through a ladies' fair organized by Sarah Josepha Hale, the woman who later wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. It took decades to build. The cornerstone was laid in 1825 by Lafayette. It was finished in 1843. It stands on the wrong hill. Almost nothing about the Battle of Bunker Hill is exactly what it appears to be. Wrong hill, wrong name, wrong caliber ammunition, wrong assumptions, wrong outcome. The British won a victory that functioned in every practical respect as a defeat. Gage had warned them, he always had. "A dear-bought victory," he wrote, "another such would have ruined us." If this found you, subscribe and leave a like. It makes a real difference to whether videos like this find a bigger audience. Leave a comment. Who do you think made the most consequential single decision at Bunker Hill? Prescott choosing Breed's Hill in the dark, Clinton losing the argument for Charlestown Neck, Stark driving his stake 50 yards out and telling his men nothing fires before then, or Howe ordering the third assault when he had every reason to stop. The argument runs 250 years and hasn't settled yet.